Welcome to Karen's HOA Nightmares. Get ready for the most outrageous, shocking, and downright hilarious tales from the world of homeowners associations. In today's story, Randy Levesque, a U.S. Marshal, thought moving to Maplewood for a quiet life with his Porsche 911 would bring peace after years of chasing criminals. But his new neighbor, Judith Barnes, the overzealous HOA president, quickly targets him with absurd fines and relentless harassment. What starts as a petty neighborhood dispute escalates when Judith hires fake cops to intimidate him. Unbeknownst to her, Randy is a trained federal agent, and he's ready to turn the tables. What Judith thought was a simple power play becomes a federal case that ruins her life, proving that justice always catches up with those who abuse their power. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and share your thoughts in the comments, and keep up with our latest hot stories. What's going on with my Porsche? 3 officers just barged into my driveway demanding my car keys over some absurd HOA rule I've never heard of. They've got badges, paperwork, and even a tow truck with them. And there's my crazy neighbor Judith, peeking out from her window like she just won the jackpot. The whole block is watching me, probably thinking the jobless guy next door finally got what was coming to him. My blood is boiling, but there's nothing I can do against actual cops. Or is there? Moving to Maplewood seemed like the ideal choice after 2 decades of tracking fugitives across state lines. I had earned the privilege of a quiet, remote assignment, working federal cases from home while my knees recovered from years of chasing criminals, and my marriage healed from late nights spent away. The house was modest, the neighbors seemed fine, and my midnight blue Porsche 911 fit perfectly in the driveway. What I didn't expect was Judith Barnes, the HOA president, who treated every neighborhood rule like a constitutional amendment, and herself like the Supreme Court. 2 days after I moved in, she appeared at my door, clipboard in hand, wearing that smile that made you check your wallet. Judith, in her mid-50s, was dressed in a perfectly pressed blazer, her hair unchanged since the Clinton era, and stood with the posture of someone who practiced authority in front of a mirror. "Welcome to Maplewood," she said, though her tone made it clear I wasn't exactly welcome. "I'm Judith Barnes, HOA president. That's quite a vehicle you have. What do you do for a living?" Her question felt more like an audit, her eyes already taking note of everything, from my work boots to the federal government license plate frame I'd forgotten to remove. "I work from home," I answered, which was technically true. My home office had secure equipment for coordinating with field teams across 6 states. "Government contractor stuff, nothing exciting?" Judith's smile tightened. "Government disability, food stamps. We maintain certain standards here in Maplewood. Nothing personal, but a car like that raises questions about income sources." Her audacity hit me like a slap, but I kept my voice calm. "Just lucky, I guess." She spent the next 10 minutes droning on about HOA rules like she was reading a grocery list. Meanwhile, her eyes never stopped scanning. My mailbox, my lawn height, the angle of my garage door. Every glance was a judgment, every pause a checkmark on her invisible list of neighborhood compliance. "The economic disparity clause is particularly important," she said, tapping her pen on her clipboard. "Vehicles that create unrealistic expectations or make other residents feel inadequate can be subject to fines. $500 for the first violation." Right then, I realized Judith wasn't just enforcing rules. She was hunting for ammunition against anyone who didn't fit her vision of suburban perfection. But I was tired, still unpacking, and thought this was just typical HOA nonsense that would pass once she found another neighbor to torment. 3 days later, the first violation notice appeared in my mailbox. Notice of violation. Economic disparity, vehicle, fine, $500. Pay within 10 days or face additional penalties. The absurdity of it made me laugh out loud, standing there in my driveway, holding a paper that essentially fined me for owning something nice. I folded it and stuck it in my back pocket, planning to file it away later as evidence. The afternoon light made the hood of my Porsche shine like a mirror, reflecting my face, which looked calmer than I felt. Calm is a tool. It helps you assess, not react. I studied the curb, the sightlines from each window, and the angle of Judith's porch. You learn a block like you learn a case. Identify pressure points, mark exits, decide what not to do. I wouldn't give her a scene. I'd give her a record. Neighbors were peeking through their windows, some curious, others pretending not to notice. That's when it hit me. Judith wasn't just targeting me. She was sending a message to the whole neighborhood. This is what happens when you stand out, when you don't conform to her idea of order, when you challenge her authority. Later that night, as I was going through case files at my home office, my secure phone rang. "Agent Levesque," the voice said, using my operational title, not my Marshal designation. "Status report on your cover assignment." I glanced at Judith's house through the window. I could see her silhouette moving behind the curtains, likely plotting her next move. Sir, the subject has initiated contact and appears to be escalating harassment tactics. She treats the neighborhood like her personal kingdom, and anyone who doesn't bow down is seen as a threat to her authority. My supervisor's voice carried that familiar tone of someone who had seen too many small-town tyrants think they were untouchable, permission to maintain cover and document all interactions. This could develop into something more than a neighbor dispute. I hung up and stared at Judith's house, knowing she was likely watching mine just as closely. From my desk drawer, I pulled out something metallic. Not my service weapon, but a small recording device used for documenting witness intimidation. The irony wasn't lost on me. I'd spent 2 decades taking down people who thought they were above the law, only to move next door to someone who seemed to think she was above everyone. I clipped the device inside my jacket and whispered to myself, "Let's see how far you're willing to go, Judith." Judith's next move proved she wasn't just an annoying HOA president. She was calculating, persistent, and apparently had connections I hadn't expected. 3 days after the violation notice, a patrol car pulled into my driveway. I instantly knew Judith had been working her charm on the local police. The officer who stepped out looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, but his badge was real enough. Detective Brooks, pushing 50 with a few extra pounds around his midsection, was the kind of cop who made the job look easy and the clock tick slower. He approached my door, and I could practically smell the coffee on his breath. "Mr. Levesque, I'm Detective Brooks with the county sheriff's office," he said in a neutral tone. "We got a call about some concerns regarding your vehicle and residence. Mind if we chat for a few minutes?" It was obvious that Judith had somehow convinced him to investigate my Porsche, likely spinning a tale of suspicious activity that sounded official enough to catch his attention. What Brooks didn't know was that he was about to become an unwitting participant in a case that would eventually grow into something much larger, a federal case that would document local corruption and conspiracy when everything fell apart. "You're 62 years old, Dad. Isn't it time to stop making waves and just live quietly like a normal retiree?" Her words carried the particular sting that comes from family members who assume you must have done something to deserve whatever treatment you're receiving. And I watched my daughter, the person I'd spent 20 years protecting from the worst parts of my job, look at me like I was the problem she needed protection from rather than the federal law enforcement officer who dedicated his career to protecting people exactly like her. That evening, after Elena left, early with polite excuses, I sat at my desk and forced my eyes across case files that wouldn't stay still. An alert blinked on my secure terminal, then another, then a cascade as the comms dashboard flashed red across multiple nodes. The message was half written when it froze on screen. Family unit compromised, subject escalating, local leakage suspected, the system locked, timed out, and refused every credential I had. The room felt louder in the quiet that followed. And for the first time in months, I recognized the shape of isolation. No network, no cover support, only a neighborhood that had chosen its story about me, and a daughter who'd started to believe it. The HOA meeting that sealed my fate was held on a Thursday evening in the community center, and Judith orchestrated it like a prosecutor presenting her case to a jury she'd already bought and paid for. I walked into a room where 37 of my neighbors sat in folding chairs, most of them avoiding direct eye contact, all of them clearly uncomfortable with whatever Judith had planned, but too intimidated to object. She'd positioned herself behind a folding table like it was a judge's bench with printed documents, photographs, and what looked like an official presentation, ready to destroy whatever reputation I had left in Maplewood. The fluorescent lighting cast harsh shadows across faces I'd hoped might become friends, but now just looked like strangers waiting to watch an execution. "Thank you all for coming," Judith began, her voice carrying the authority of someone who had been planning this moment for months. "We have a serious situation that requires community action. As you know, we've had ongoing issues with a resident who refuses to comply with basic community standards, shows a pattern of suspicious behavior, and has created an atmosphere of uncertainty that affects all of our property values." She gestured toward an easel where she'd mounted enlarged photographs of my house, my car, my garage door, even my mailbox, like evidence in a criminal trial where the crime was existing in her neighborhood. The absurdity would have been laughable if it weren't so effectively destroying my life in front of people who might have been friends under different circumstances. The presentation continued for 23 minutes with Judith detailing every interaction we'd had, every complaint she'd filed, every piece of evidence she'd collected to prove that I was somehow a threat to community safety and property values. She referenced my suspicious work schedule, my uncooperative attitude toward legitimate HOA concerns, and my pattern of behavior that suggests possible illegal activity. The accusations were carefully crafted to sound official, without being specific enough to be proven false. And I watched my neighbors' faces change from uncertainty to suspicion to active hostility. As Judith painted me as some kind of suburban criminal mastermind hiding in plain sight, I wrote down her verbs. Suggests, indicates, appears, soft words that harden when no one challenges them. I asked for a copy of the packet, and she said the records would be available after the vote. Process should not chase outcome. The process should lead it. No one in the room wanted that sentence spoken out loud, so I kept it on paper. When she finally called for a vote on whether to support additional measures to address the ongoing situation, the result was 29 in favor, 4 abstentions, and 4 opposed. Mrs. Patterson looked physically ill as she raised her hand to support Judith's motion. But fear won over conscience when it came time to choose sides. The young couple with the golden retriever stared at their hands during the vote, clearly wanting no part of the decision, but too afraid of becoming Judith's next targets to oppose her openly. Even Rodriguez, the retired veteran who'd initially seemed friendly, stayed neutral when his voice might have mattered most. The isolation was complete, official, and documented in meeting minutes that would become part of the permanent HOA record. What Judith had planned next went far beyond typical HOA harassment, and entered territory that should have terrified anyone with a basic understanding of federal law. 2 days after the community meeting, I watched through my home security system as she met with 3 men in the parking lot of a costume rental shop 15 mi outside of Maplewood. The conversation lasted 47 minutes with Judith showing them photographs, pointing at what appeared to be official documents and handing over an envelope that was almost certainly full of cash. The men weren't your typical suburban contractors. They moved with the confidence of people who'd done questionable work before, and weren't particularly concerned about the legal implications of whatever Judith was purchasing. The plan, as I later learned through my own investigative channels, was breathtakingly illegal and absolutely brilliant in its simplicity. Judith had hired a specialty services company that provided official-looking personnel for various purposes, essentially professional actors who specialized in impersonating authority figures for corporate training, private investigations, and apparently personal vendettas against neighbors who owned cars that threatened HOA aesthetic standards. She had commissioned police uniforms, official-looking badges, forged paperwork that resembled federal seizure warrants, and even arranged for a tow truck with police-style markings to make the whole operation look completely legitimate to anyone watching from their windows. The 3 men Judith hired weren't random criminals. They were professionals who'd built a business around the gray areas of impersonation law, walking the line between theatrical services and actual fraud with the skill of people who'd studied exactly how far they could push legal boundaries without triggering serious federal attention. What they hadn't counted on was that their client was essentially hiring them to assault a federal law enforcement officer in front of witnesses, which would transform their specialty services business into a federal conspiracy charge that carried 5 to 10 years in prison. Judith had managed to upgrade what should have been a simple scam into a case that would involve multiple federal agencies, RICO violations, and conspiracy charges that would destroy everyone involved. During these preparations, I was conducting my own tactical preparation that Judith mistook for defeat and surrender. She watched me through her blinds as I spent hours in my garage, assuming I was hiding from the community pressure, or perhaps preparing to flee before her final solution could be implemented. What she couldn't see was that I was actually setting up sophisticated recording equipment, coordinating with federal backup teams, and documenting every aspect of her escalating criminal conspiracy for what would become one of the most thoroughly documented cases of authority impersonation and federal officer intimidation in recent bureau history. The irony was perfect. While Judith thought she was finally cornering her victim, she was actually building the case that would send her to federal prison. The night before her plan was set to launch, Judith's SUV idled without lights at the corner, engineticking as it cooled. She watched the 3 uniforms drift past my address, not from a bedroom window, but from behind her windshield, a pen tapping the rim of a paper cup. I stood in darkness on the far side of my living room, vest snug, counting their timing and routes against the quiet sweep of the block. 20 years of muzzle memory did the rest. Let her think this was reconnaissance. It was documentation. Have you ever had a neighbor who made your life hell? Drop a comment with your worst HOA story. I bet mine still tops yours after what happens next. Night settled over Maplewood like a lid, and I let the house cool to a working silence. In the garage, I laid 2 strips of painter's tape along the concrete and marked them with a pencil so any shift in tire position would show on camera. I ran a fingertip across the license plate screws and felt a fresh burr where someone had tried a wrong-sized driver. Good to know and better to photograph. On my desk, I opened a blank form and wrote a short script for my own voice. Ask for names. Ask for the issuing agency. Ask for the supervisor on duty and the call sign. Do not argue the law on the porch. Ask for a number to call back. Simple questions weigh more than speeches when the recorder plays. I checked the city website for scheduled utility work and found none on our block. If a truck appeared in the morning, it would not be there to fix the lights. I printed the page for the file. Then I stood in the dark living room and counted the seconds it took a car to roll from the bend to my drive. 7 on a slow night. Fewer when a driver wants momentum. The next morning arrived with the kind of suburban quiet that makes dramatic events feel surreal. Birds chirping, sprinklers running, the distant sound of lawnmowers starting their weekly battle against nature's refusal to stay perfectly manicured. I checked the street once without opening the door. Reflections tell more truth than glass. The hood of a parked sedan gave me the north side. A framed photo by the entry gave me the south in the corner of its glass. Nothing moved except water arcing from a sprinkler across a patch of lawn that would soon be trampled by attention. It is better to confirm calm than to assume it. At exactly 2 p.m., just as Judith had announced to the neighborhood, 3 men in crisp police uniforms pulled up to my house in what looked like an official unmarked police vehicle, complete with government plates and the kind of subtle authority that makes normal people automatically comply with whatever demands might follow. The precision of their timing, the professional quality of their uniforms, and the confident way they approached my front door would have convinced anyone watching that this was legitimate law enforcement, conducting official business on a residential street where the biggest crime was usually someone forgetting to bring in their garbage cans. Judith held her station at the front window as if it were a box seat. Across the block, fabric shifted at the edges of blinds. It felt staged, roles memorized. Only one cube was missing from their script. The unmarked cars with cameras already rolling. The lead fake cop was maybe 35, built like someone who'd done legitimate security work before sliding into less legal employment. And he carried himself with just enough authentic authority to fool anyone who wasn't trained to spot the subtle differences between real and manufactured law enforcement presence. His backup looked nervous, constantly checking his equipment and glancing around like he wasn't entirely comfortable with whatever they had been hired to do. But the money Judith had offered was apparently worth whatever legal risks he thought he might be taking. The third man stayed by their vehicle, clipboard in hand, playing the role of administrative support, while actually serving as lookout and driver for their planned escape once they'd completed Judith's vision of suburban justice. They approached my door with the measured pace of people who'd rehearsed this scenario, probably in Judith's living room, while she explained exactly how she wanted the confrontation to unfold. The lead fake cop had actual handcuffs hanging from his belt, a radio that crackled with what sounded like official police communications, and a badge that would pass casual inspection from anyone who wasn't trained to spot the telltale signs of quality forgery. His uniform read as convincing at a glance. Patches aligned, insignia where they should be, tactical boots broken in just enough. But the tells were there if you knew where to look. The radio traffic sounded canned. The badge numbering didn't match local convention, and their body language lacked the hard edges of people who've learned to treat every doorstep as potentially dangerous. As they reached my front door, I was watching through my security system while simultaneously coordinating with my real backup through a throat microphone that Judith's surveillance couldn't detect. A subject approaching target location. 3 individuals in law enforcement costumes. 1 vehicle with fraudulent government plates. Multiple witnesses present. Federal response team standing by. The response came through my earpiece with a calm professionalism of agents who had spent their careers dealing with people who thought that they could outsmart federal law enforcement. Copy that, Levesque. Let them make their play. We'll have everything documented for prosecution. The first words came before the door finished opening. Officer Johnson, Federal Tax Enforcement Division, warrant to seize your Porsche in connection with tax evasion. He asked for the keys and space to impound. The cadence was polished. The content wasn't. Wrong division, wrong process, wrong law. I let my voice shake slightly, playing the role of a confused citizen who didn't understand what was happening to him. Officers, I think there's been some mistake. I pay me taxes and I've never had any problems with the government. Can I see some identification? Maybe call your supervisor to clear this up. The request was perfectly reasonable and exactly what any innocent person would ask. But it also put the fake cops in the position of having to produce documentation they probably hoped wouldn't be closely examined. Officer Johnson held up his badge with the confidence of someone who'd never had it questioned, while his nervous backup pulled out what looked like an official warrant, complete with federal seals, judicial signatures, and enough legal language to impress anyone who didn't know that real federal seizure warrants don't work anything like the document he was showing me. Sir, This is a time-sensitive federal operation, Johnson continued, his voice gaining authority as he warmed to his performance. We have probable cause to believe this vehicle was purchased with unreported income, and federal law requires immediate seizure pending investigation. You can cooperate now and avoid additional charges, or we can arrest you for obstruction and take the vehicle anyway. What's it going to be? The threat was delivered with just enough menace to intimidate most people into compliance, and I could see Judith practically vibrating with excitement as she watched from her window, probably imagining how satisfying it would be to finally see the neighborhood. Troublemaker get his comeuppance from legitimate federal authority figures. The backup fake cop was getting more nervous as the conversation continued, constantly checking his watch and glancing toward the street like he was worried about something his partners hadn't told him to expect. Look, man, just give us the keys and this will all be over quickly. No need to make this harder than it has to be, he said, abandoning the professional tone and revealing the kind of street-level intimidation tactics that suggested his law enforcement experience might have come from the wrong side of the badge. His nervousness was actually helping their cause. Real cops dealing with financial crimes would be exactly this anxious about public confrontations that could turn violent. So, his obvious discomfort added authenticity to what was otherwise becoming an increasingly absurd performance. I glanced around the neighborhood, noting which windows had people watching, which houses seemed empty, and where my real backup was positioned for the arrest that was about to happen. Please, officers, I really think there's been some mistake. I'm just a government contractor trying to live quietly in this neighborhood. I don't want any trouble with federal authorities. My voice carried exactly the right note of confused fear that would make Judith feel triumphant, while also ensuring that every neighbor watching would remember that I'd tried to cooperate before everything went sideways. The fake cops exchanged glances that suggested they thought that this was going exactly as planned, with the added bonus of having a compliant victim who wouldn't cause scenes or complications that might draw unwanted attention to their operation. Officer Johnson stepped closer, close enough that I could see the imperfections in his badge and smell the coffee on his breath, completely unaware that everything he said was being recorded by multiple federal agencies and would be used to ensure he spent the next 5 to 10 years in federal prison. Time's up, buddy. We're taking that car one way or another. You can either hand over the keys like a good citizen, or we can arrest you right here in front of all your neighbors and take them anyway. What's it going to be? The ultimatum was delivered with the confidence of someone who thought he held all the cards, while I prepared to show him exactly what happened when petty criminals tried to intimidate federal law enforcement officers who'd spent their careers dealing with people far more dangerous than Judith's hired help. The moment when everything shifted felt like the air pressure changing before a thunderstorm. You could sense something fundamental was about to happen, even if the fake cops were too focused on their performance to notice the change in atmosphere. Officer Johnson reached for my arm with the casual confidence of someone who'd spent the last 10 minutes, assuming I was just another suburban victim who would fold under pressure. But the second his fingers made contact with my jacket, 20 years of federal training kicked in with the precision of muscle memory that had kept me alive through 2 decades of arresting people who absolutely did not want to be arrested. I caught his wrist in a grip that immediately communicated to anyone with real law enforcement experience that they just made a serious tactical error. You sure you want to do that, Officer Johnson? The question came out in a voice that no longer shook with fear, no longer carried the confusion of a law-abiding citizen being harassed by government authority. Instead, it carried the calm, measured tone of someone who'd spent 20 years dealing with people who thought they could intimidate federal agents. And Johnson's eyes widened as he realized that something had gone very wrong with what was supposed to be a simple intimidation job. His backup stepped forward, probably thinking they could use physical numbers to regain control of a situation that was rapidly spinning beyond there to manage. But he stopped dead when he saw my expression change from confused victim to something that looked distinctly predatory. "What's your badge number, Officer Johnson?" he asked, keeping his wrist where it was. "And this paperwork? Wrong case format, wrong signatures, wrong playbook." I didn't need to lecture. The realization hit him faster than any explanation could, and I watched confusion curdle into the kind of panic that says a man finally understands what he stepped into. The nervous backup cop was now actively sweating, which had nothing to do with the afternoon temperature and everything, to do with the growing realization that whatever Judith had hired them to do was turning into something far more serious than they had been prepared for. "Look, man, we're just doing a job here. Nobody wants any trouble, right? Maybe we can work something out." The words tumbled out with the desperation of someone who could see his carefully planned criminal enterprise collapsing in real time. But his attempt at negotiation only confirmed what I already knew. These weren't professional law enforcement officers following legitimate procedures. They were hired actors who'd gotten in over their heads and were about to discover the difference between impersonating cops for corporate training videos and actually attempting to intimidate federal law enforcement. Judith was still watching from her window, but her expression had changed from triumphant anticipation to something that looked distinctly worried, like someone who just realized that her perfect plan might not be unfolding exactly as she'd scripted it. The street went quiet in that strange, heavy way that precedes a storm. Curtains stilled, a latch clicked. On Rodriguez's porch, a shadow straightened, measuring the distance and the stakes. No one needed phones now. Everyone understood this was no longer a neighborhood spectacle. I released Johnson's wrist and stepped back, giving myself tactical distance while reaching into my jacket with the deliberate slowness of someone who wanted everyone watching to see exactly what was about to happen. Breath slowed, vision narrowed to useful edges. The radio static from down the block thinned to a thread. I counted the beat it takes a man to decide whether to run. He did not run. He waited for permission that would not come. The street waited with him. Gentlemen, before this goes any further, I think there's something you should know about the person you've been hired to intimidate. The fake cops were now clearly realizing that their simple intimidation job had become something far more complex and dangerous. But they were committed to a course of action that was about to destroy their lives in ways they couldn't possibly have anticipated when Judith first approached them with her suburban revenge fantasy. What happened next reset the room. I took out my credentials and held them where every set of eyes could meet them. Deputy U.S. Marshal Randy Levesque, badge number 47291, 20 years. Thousands of arrests. The authority here wasn't a costume. It was jurisdiction. Deputy U.S. Marshal Randy Levesque, badge number 47291, I said, holding my credentials where everyone could see them while simultaneously watching the blood drain from three faces as professional criminals realized they just attempted to intimidate a federal law enforcement officer in front of multiple witnesses. You gentlemen are under arrest for impersonating federal officers, conspiracy to commit fraud, and attempted intimidation of a federal law enforcement agent. You have the right to remain silent, and I strongly suggest you exercise that right immediately. The words came out with the calm authority of someone who delivered this speech thousands of times, but never under circumstances quite this personally satisfying. Johnson's fake confidence evaporated like morning mist, replaced by the kind of panic that comes from realizing your relatively minor criminal enterprise has just become a federal case with mandatory minimum sentencing guidelines. Wait, what? You can't be. You're just some unemployed guy with a fancy car. The lady said you were nobody. Just some deadbeat trying to look important. His voice cracked with the desperation of someone whose carefully constructed worldview was collapsing in real time. And I almost felt sorry for him until I remembered that he'd been perfectly willing to intimidate and potentially assault what he thought was an innocent civilian for Judith's suburban power trip. The lady was wrong about a lot of things, I replied, pulling out my handcuffs. The real ones that had restrained everyone from white-collar embezzlers to violent fugitives during my 2 decades of federal service. Starting with thinking she could hire criminals to solve her HOA problems without facing federal consequences. The backup cop made a movement that looked like he might be considering running, but stopped when he realized that federal marshals don't work alone, and running from this situation would only add fleeing and eluding charges to what was already going to be a very long federal indictment. The professional takedown that followed was textbook federal law enforcement, controlled, efficient, and absolutely by the book. Because the last thing I wanted was some defense attorney claiming excessive force when these cases went to trial. Johnson went down with the kind of compliance that comes from finally understanding that resistance would only make everything worse, while his backup actually seemed relieved that the charade was finally over and he could stop pretending to be something he was never trained to be. The third fake cop by the vehicle looked like he was considering making a break for it until he saw real federal agents emerging from unmarked cars throughout the neighborhood, all of them wearing the kind of tactical gears that makes it very clear that running is not a viable option. Within 3 minutes, 3 professional criminals who'd thought that they were participating in an elaborate prank were face down on my driveway in zip-tie restraints, while real federal agents secured the scene and began the process of documenting what would become one of the most thoroughly prosecuted cases of law enforcement impersonation in recent memory. The look on Judith's face as she watched from her window was absolutely priceless. The expression of someone who just realized that her perfect plan to destroy her neighbor had instead destroyed her own life in ways she couldn't possibly have anticipated when she first decided that a federal law enforcement officer was just another suburban victim she could intimidate into compliance. As Randy handcuffs the fake cops, Judith comes running out screaming, "What are you doing?" "They're police officers." Randy turns to her with his badge visible. No, Judith, they're criminals just like you're about to be. The transformation of my quiet suburban street into a federal crime scene happened with the kind of precision that comes from months of planning and coordination between multiple law enforcement agencies. Within minutes of my arrest by the fake cops, unmarked vehicles that had been positioned throughout Maplewood began converging on the location, disgorging real federal agents wearing tactical gear that made it very clear to everyone watching that this was not some neighborhood dispute that had gotten out of hand. These were serious federal law enforcement officers conducting a serious federal operation that had been building for months, while Judith thought she was just harassing some unemployed loser with a fancy car. Agent Laura Mitchell emerged from the lead vehicle with the calm professionalism of someone who'd spent 15 years building federal cases against people who thought they were too smart to get caught by government investigators. She approached Judith, who was still standing in her driveway with the expression of someone trying to process how her perfect revenge plan had suddenly turned into the worst day of her life and produced the kind of official credentials that make it very clear when someone's suburban power trip has escalated into federal criminal territory. Judith Barnes, I'm Special Agent Mitchell with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You're under arrest for conspiracy to impersonate federal officers, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to assault a federal law enforcement agent. Judith's reaction was exactly what you'd expect from someone whose carefully constructed world of suburban authority had just been revealed as a criminal conspiracy that would send her to federal prison for the next 5 to 10 years. This is impossible. I don't know what you're talking about. Those were real police officers conducting legitimate business. The denial came out in a voice that was climbing toward hysteria. But Agent Mitchell had probably heard similar protests from hundreds of federal defendants who thought their crimes would never catch up with them. Ma'am, we have recordings of your conversations with the individuals you hired, bank records showing the payments you made, and testimony from multiple witnesses regarding your systematic harassment of a federal law enforcement officer. The handcuffs clicking onto Judith's wrists produced the kind of metallic sound that echoes in suburban neighborhoods where the biggest excitement is usually someone's garbage cans blowing over in a windstorm. But this sound represented the end of months of intimidation, harassment, and escalating criminal behavior that had started with petty HOA violations and ended with federal conspiracy charges, carrying mandatory minimum sentences that would ensure Judith had plenty of time to think about her choices while serving her debt to society in federal custody. You have the right to remain silent, Agent Mitchell continued, and given the federal charges you're facing, I'd strongly recommend exercising that right until you can speak with an attorney who understands federal criminal law. The neighbors who had spent months watching Judith's campaign against me were now watching her be arrested by real federal agents, and the expressions on their faces ranged from shock to guilt to the kind of relief that comes from finally seeing a neighborhood bully face real consequences for their actions. Mrs. Patterson was crying, whether from guilt over her complicity or relief that Judith's reign of terror was finally over, I couldn't tell. Rodriguez stepped forward like he wanted to say something, probably an apology for not standing up when his voice might have mattered. But the presence of federal agents conducting arrests made casual conversation seem inappropriate for the gravity of the situation. The ripple effect of watching their HOA president get arrested by federal agents hit the Maplewood community like a psychological earthquake that forced everyone to consider everything they thought they knew about the past 6 months of neighborhood drama. These were people who'd convinced themselves that going along with Judith's harassment was easier than getting involved. That staying neutral in the face of obvious bullying was somehow the moral high ground. That a federal law enforcement officer was just some suspicious character who deserved whatever treatment the HOA president decided to dish out. Now they were watching that same HOA president get loaded into the back of a federal vehicle while agents secured evidence that would be used to prosecute her for crimes they didn't even know were possible in suburban neighborhoods. "Oh my God, we almost became accomplices to assaulting a federal agent," Mrs. Patterson whispered, and her words carried the weight of a community that had spent months being manipulated into participating in what was essentially a criminal conspiracy. The realization was spreading through the crowd of neighbors like a virus. They hadn't just been innocent bystanders watching neighbor drama unfold. They'd been unwitting participants in witness intimidation, harassment of a federal officer, and conspiracy to obstruct justice. Every vote they'd cast supporting Judith's additional measures, every time they'd shunned me at her encouragement, every moment they'd chosen her version of events over basic human decency, had potentially made them accessories to federal crimes. Rodriguez approached me with the demeanor of someone who'd spent sleepless nights knowing he should have spoken up, but hadn't found the courage until it was too late to matter. Marshal Levesque, I want to apologize. I knew something wasn't right about how Judith was treating you, but I was afraid of becoming her next target if I spoke up. I served 3 tours in Afghanistan, but I was too scared of some HOA president to do the right thing when it counted. His words carried the shame of someone whose military service had taught him about courage and honor, but whose civilian life had let fear override those principles when they were needed most. The young couple with the golden retriever were holding each other like they'd just survived a natural disaster, probably realizing that their decision to avoid me rather than risk Judith's wrath had made them witnesses to federal crimes rather than the neutral parties they'd thought they were. We had no idea she was planning anything illegal, the wife said. Though her words sounded like someone trying to convince herself as much as anyone listening, she just said there were concerns about suspicious behavior and that the community needed to stick together. We thought we were just being good neighbors by supporting the HOA president's legitimate concerns about neighborhood safety. Elena's arrival in the middle of this federal law enforcement operation was like the final piece of a puzzle falling into place. My daughter pulling into a driveway where fake cops were being loaded into federal vehicles while real agents processed evidence from the most thoroughly documented case of neighbor harassment in recent memory. She got out of her car with the expression of someone trying to process a scene that looked like it belonged in a federal crime drama rather than the quiet suburban neighborhood where her father had moved for peace and quiet. Dad, what? How? Are those real FBI agents? Did someone just get arrested in your driveway? The questions tumbled out with the confusion of someone whose understanding of her father's life was being completely rewritten in real time. Elena, sweetheart, remember when I told you I work for the government? I said, putting my arm around my daughter who had spent months being ashamed of what she thought was her father's weakness. I'm a deputy U.S. Marshal. I have been for 20 years. Judith didn't just harass some unemployed loser. She systematically intimidated a federal law enforcement officer, hired criminals to impersonate government agents, and essentially built a federal case against herself, while thinking she was just dealing with a neighborhood troublemaker who owned a car that threatened her sense of suburban order. Judith's perp walked past the neighbors who had spent months enabling her harassment campaign was the kind of moment that burns itself into community memory. The image of someone who had wielded HOA authority like a weapon being led away in federal handcuffs, while real law enforcement officers treated her like exactly what she'd become. A federal criminal whose suburban power trip had escalated into crimes that would define her legacy for the rest of her life. The woman who'd spent months photographing my garbage cans and measuring my grass. Height was no having her own rights read to her by agents, who'd built careers prosecuting people who thought they were above the law. And every neighbor who'd watched her systematic campaign against me was now watching her face the consequences of thinking federal law enforcement officers were just another target for HOA intimidation. The media attention that followed was swift and brutal, turning Judith's arrest into exactly the kind of local news story that destroys reputations and becomes a cautionary tale for anyone who thinks neighborhood politics can escalate into federal crimes without serious consequences. Local HOA president arrested in federal conspiracy case ran as the lead story on 3 different news stations, complete with footage of Judith being loaded into federal vehicles, while reporters explained how a dispute over parking violations had escalated into charges, carrying 5 to 10 years in federal prison. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The woman who had tried to destroy my reputation for owning an expensive car was now having her own mugshot broadcast across the region as an example of how suburban authority can turn criminal when wielded by people with no understanding of actual legal boundaries. Mrs. Patterson approached me with homemade cookies and an apology that carried the weight of someone who had spent sleepless nights knowing she'd failed a basic test of human decency. Marshal Levesque, I brought these when you first moved in, and I should have kept bringing them every week instead of letting Judith convince me you were some kind of threat to our community. I was scared of her, but that's no excuse for abandoning a neighbor who never did anything wrong except own something nice and work from home. Her words represented what I hoped was the beginning of a community, reckoning with how they'd allowed fear of one person's manufactured authority to override their basic obligation to treat neighbors with dignity and respect. The young couple with the golden retriever brought their dog over for the introduction. That should have happened months ago, if Judith hadn't convinced everyone that associating with me was somehow dangerous to their standing in the neighborhood. We are Jake and Emma Richardson, the husband said, extending his hand with the sheepish expression of someone who knew they'd missed obvious signs of federal law enforcement presence because they'd been too focused on avoiding HOA drama. Our dog is Charlie, and he's been wanting to meet you since you moved in, but we were too worried about Judith's reaction to let him wander over here. Turns out we were worried about the wrong person's reaction to neighborly behavior. Rodriguez organized an impromptu neighborhood gathering that evening, partly to process what had happened, and partly to begin the work of rebuilding community relationships that had been poisoned by months of Judith's divisive leadership. I think we all learned something about what happens when we let fear override our obligation to stand up for what's right, he said, addressing the group of neighbors who'd gathered in his backyard to discuss how they'd move forward as a community that had nearly become accessories to federal crimes. Marshal Levesque served his country for 20 years, moved here for peace and quiet, and instead of welcoming a federal law enforcement officer to our neighborhood, we let him. Judith's federal sentencing 3 months later was attended by several Maplewood residents who wanted to see the conclusion of the case that had transformed their understanding of neighborhood, politics, and federal law enforcement. Judge Patricia Williams delivered a sentence that reflected both the seriousness of Judith's crimes and the broader implications of civilian attempts to intimidate federal law enforcement officers. 7 years in federal prison, followed by 3 years of supervised probation. Full restitution for property damage and legal costs, and a lifetime ban from serving in any homeowners association leadership position. Miss Barnes, your actions represent a fundamental misunderstanding of both federal law and the responsibilities that come with community leadership. Judge Williams said, her words carrying the weight of someone who had seen too many cases where small-time authority had escalated into serious federal crimes. The transformation of Maplewood under Rodriguez's leadership as the new HOA president was like watching a community recover from an abusive relationship. Tentative at first, then increasingly confident as people remembered what normal neighborhood interactions looked like when they weren't filtered through fear of arbitrary punishment for imaginary violations. The first item of business was repealing Judith's economic disparity rule and about 15 other regulations that had been designed more for harassment than community improvement. Property values actually increased once potential buyers realized they wouldn't be moving into a neighborhood where the HOA president might have them arrested for owning something nice. And the general atmosphere shifted from fearful compliance to the kind of friendly community interaction that most people expect from suburban living. At the next meeting, Rodriguez placed a simple agenda on a single page and ended on time. People clapped once and laughed at themselves for clapping. A gardenerist for a list of approved tree species that would not crack sidewalks. A new parent asked about the crosswalk paint by the bus stop. The question sounded like a place of healing. No one said Judith's name. That helped. Elena's transformation from embarrassed daughter to proud family member was perhaps the most personally satisfying aspect of the entire ordeal. And it came with the added bonus of inspiring her to change her career path from corporate law to federal law enforcement. Dad, I spent months being ashamed of what I thought was your weakness when I should have been proud of your strength in maintaining cover and building a federal case while everyone around you thought you were just some neighborhood troublemaker, she said during one of our weekend visits that had resumed with enthusiasm once she realized her father was someone worthy of respect rather than embarrassment. I want to learn how to do what you do. How to protect communities from people who think authority means they can hurt other people without consequences. My secure phone rang on a quiet Tuesday evening 6 months after Judith's sentencing, and the familiar voice of my federal supervisor carried the tone of someone who'd been impressed with how the Maplewood operation had unfolded. Marshal Levesque, we have a situation in Phoenix. The HOA president has just hired a private investigator to dig up dirt on a new veteran neighbor who moved in with a motorcycle that supposedly violates community aesthetic standards. The pattern matches what we saw with Judith Barnes, and we think there might be a broader network of people who think federal law enforcement officers are legitimate targets for suburban intimidation campaigns. I looked out my window toward the house where Judith used to live, now occupied by a retired teacher who brought me vegetables from her garden, and asked about my work with the genuine interest of someone who respected federal law enforcement rather than seeing it as a threat to neighborhood conformity. Elena was sitting at my kitchen table working on her federal law enforcement application essays, having discovered that her father's career was something she wanted to emulate rather than escape from, and her presence reminded me that sometimes the most important victories are the personal ones that restore family relationships, damaged by maintaining necessary professional cover. Send me the details on Phoenix, I told my supervisor, already mentally preparing for another undercover assignment, where some suburban tyrant had convinced themselves that federal law enforcement officers were just another group of citizens they could intimidate into compliance with their vision of community order. Looks like someone in Arizona needs to learn what happened to the last HOA president who tried to mess with federal agents. And I'm thinking Elena might want to observe this operation as part of her law enforcement education. Think Judith got what she deserved? Wait until you hear about the Phoenix HOA president in my next story. That One makes Judith look like an amateur when it comes to underestimating federal law enforcement officers who've spent their careers dealing with people who think they're above the law. And that's how one HOA Karen's power trip turned into a federal case that destroyed her life forever. Judith thought she was dealing with some unemployed loser who wouldn't fight back, but she picked the wrong neighbor to mess with. Sometimes justice takes time, but when it finally arrives, it's absolutely beautiful to watch. You know what I love most about this story? It proves that bullies like Judith always underestimate the people they target. She spent months building her case against what she thought was a helpless victim, never realizing she was actually documenting her own crimes against a federal law enforcement officer. The irony is so perfect you couldn't write it better if you tried. This whole experience taught me something important about standing up to people who abuse whatever small authority they think they have. Whether it's an HOA president, a middle manager, or just some neighbor who thinks they run the block, these people count on everyone else being too scared or too tired to fight back. But sometimes, just sometimes, they mess with someone who has the training, resources, and legal authority to put them exactly where they belong. Elena's transformation from embarrassed daughter to proud family member studying criminal justice was the real victory here. Seeing your own child lose faith in you because of someone else's lies, then watching that faith get restored when the truth finally comes out. That's worth every minute of harassment Judith put me through. Here at Echo Stories, we believe every story deserves to be heard, especially Theon's, where justice finally catches up with people who thought they were untouchable.